And as always, we leave you with our Everybody Has a Story segment. This week, Cody Pomeranz sat down with Yale Junior Minami Funkoshi. She has written prolifically about China, and her writings have been published across campus and the world. Here at Yale, she's written for the Yale Globalist and Yale's International Affairs magazine. Professionally, her writing has been seen in Tea Leaf Nation, The Atlantic, the New York Times China, and the Wall Street Journal Asia, where she worked as an opinion intern. Here are a few highlights from that interview.
Hi, welcome to YTV and this week's segment of Everybody Has a Story. Here on this show, we try to bring you the interesting stories of students, professors, and campus guests each week. And this week, one of those students is Saybrook's Minami Funkoshi. The definition of a global citizen, Minami has lived all over Asia, traveled the world, and reported on issues for the Wall Street Journal and The Atlantic. Minami, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's start with where you were born. You were born in Japan, you moved to India, back to Japan, then to Malaysia for middle and high school, then back to Japan, and now you find yourself here in New Haven. What do you say when people ask, where are you from?
That was a big issue for me when I came to the US because I don't have an American accent. People ask, where are you from? And I would always hesitate before saying I'm from Japan because I spent half of my life abroad in Malaysia. That's when I started learning English, and now Japanese isn't my strongest language. I find that I'm much more comfortable in English. So for a while I felt like it's not accurate to say I'm Japanese, but I think over the years I came to realize that I am more Japanese than I had thought, and now I just say I'm from Japan.
Now, from what I understand, these questions of national identity became much more serious, even life and death for some people, when you were in China a year ago. Can you talk about what it was like to be there for the anti-Japanese riots?
Sure. So last year I took a year off and was studying in Beijing and Taipei through the Light Fellowship. And I was there beginning June 2012. And in September, the anti-Japan riots broke out in China because Japan nationalized some of the islands in East China Sea that both China and Japan were claiming sovereignty over. And at first, I saw it as a diplomatic issue that wouldn't affect me on a day-to-day basis. And I was at a job interview targeted at Japanese citizens in China, and I was waiting at the lobby and overheard a group of Japanese people around my age talking about one of their friends who a few days ago had gone to this area of Beijing that's known to have a lot of expats. And she was just walking on the street and a Chinese man approached her and asked, "Where are you from?" She sensed that something was strange. So she lied and said, "I'm from Korea." And the Chinese man said, "Good, if you were Japanese, I would have killed you." And that was the moment when the Japan-China issue became personal and real to me. Like, from that day on, I stopped going to that area of Beijing. I stopped telling strangers on the street, like cab drivers, who would always ask me, "Where are you from?" And before I would just say I'm from Japan and nothing would happen, but I stopped saying that. I said I'm American or Korean or whatever. And I think I was in that state for a month or so, feeling paranoid and scared that someone on the street would somehow recognize that I'm from Japan and start chasing me with a knife. And I knew realistically this wouldn't happen, but given that a lot of Japanese cars owned by Chinese people were being smashed and Japanese factories were lit on fire and Japanese schools and offices closed in China for safety reasons. So I couldn't decide if it was irrational for me to think that way, And so that continued for a while. And after a month or so, I started getting just really claustrophobic, staying in one area of Beijing, not telling people that I'm Japanese. So I started talking to my close Chinese friends about the issue, asking, like, what do you think about all these people kind of expressing their anger toward Japan in violent ways? Like, what do you think it's possible to even talk about it? And surprisingly, a lot of my friends were ashamed that there was so much violence going on, and I was able to talk about it openly without feeling threatened. So slowly I expanded the circle and started telling strangers that I met that I'm Japanese again. And one cab driver that I met actually warned me to not advertise that I'm from Japan, and was sincerely concerned for my safety. So I think that's when I started writing about China and China-Japan relationship, because I felt like Japanese people definitely have a very one-sided view of China, and Chinese people also have a very set view on Japan. So it's trying to break those stereotypes and talk about what it was like for me as a Japanese citizen to be in China was very cathartic.
Now let's talk about the source of a lot of the tensions, which, as you mentioned, is this island dispute in the East China Sea. On Tuesday, United States Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel made his first official visit to China, and the Chinese defense minister made China's stance abundantly clear, I think, saying, quote, China has indisputable sovereignty over these islands, and that China will, quote, make no compromise, no concession, no treaty, end quote. He also added, quote, the Chinese military can assemble as soon as summoned, fight any battle, and win, end quote. How do you see this issue resolving itself? And do you think that these countries, their leaders, or the people in them actually want to see conflict in the East China Sea?
I think what the Chinese official said about having absolute sovereignty over the island is consistent with what they have said in the past. They say the same thing about the islands in South China Sea, and they've always been saying that the islands in East China Sea are historically part of China. And so in that way, I don't think that the latest statement is any break or sign of escalation. I think about a year ago, there was a real concern for accidental war breaking out, because there were so many planes flying through that zone, and although neither country wants war, like, they have economic ties that are too strong for that. They can't really survive without one another economically. And I think at some point there was a fear of something happening accidentally, but I think the issue has dragged on for long enough that I think there isn't a high chance of war breaking out. And I think both sides see a return to the status quo as the best option, because, like, neither of them is going to give up the islands, and that ambiguous kind of sharing of, I guess, sovereignty almost has continued for 30, 40 years. And I think if we can somehow go back to that, that would be the best choice for both sides.
So you talk about bridging the gap between China and Japan. The Obama administration has made a concerted effort to make a, quote, pivot towards Asia. What role do you see the United States having in bridging this gap between China and Japan?
I think the United States is definitely in between China and Japan in that it has strong economic ties with both. And recently, Obama has been trying to establish a closer personal connection with Premier Xi Jinping from China. For the first time, I think, in US diplomatic history, the First Lady and their children both visited China for 1 week. And I think that was longer than any other state family visit. And that personal relationship, I think, would help in making sure nothing escalates on China's side. As for Japan, US already has a security treaty with Japan, so if something would happen, if China were to attack Japan, then the US would have to step in on Japan's side. And I think the key for the US on this front is to also ensure that Japan feels that Obama's words have credibility, that if something does happen, US will be on its side. And this balance is difficult to juggle. Like, although Michelle Obama went to China and visited for 1 week, she just announced that she won't be joining Obama's visit to Japan. And there are definitely a lot of ministers in Japan who feel slighted. But somehow maintaining the balance on a personal and diplomatic level between the two would be the best way for the US to bridge the gap.
Minami Funkoshi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invite.
And as always, thank you for joining us for YTV. I'm Cody Pomeranz. See you next time.
To see the full interview, go to the YTV website under the features page.